Steve, thanks a million for joining me. How have you been, mate?
Yeah, it's an absolute pleasure. Good to see you. I've been fine, thanks. Busy, but fine.
Very good, thank you. Okay, let's straight into it. What is your emotional state and your internal dialogue as you're throwing on the suit that everyone can kind of picture in order to go approach what you know is a dangerous explosive?
Okay, that's a really good one to start with. Do you know what? When I was doing it, when I was putting on the suit, and it's a big, heavy suit, so you stand there with your arms outstretched, and members of your team have to help you into it. And then the final bit is where somebody slips on the helmet over your head, because by that time your arms aren't really very flexible for getting the helmet on. And they always have to make sure, or you have to make sure that they make sure that your ears aren't folded over when the helmet goes on, because if you're going down to a device, the last thing you want is your ears folded over. But what's your mental state? Well, I'm sure everybody's different. But for me, because the training was so good, and I would suggest that most people would say this to you, your focus is entirely on getting the job done. You don't really think at the time about, oh, crikey, this could go bang on me at any moment. You're really very focused on, almost like a game of chess, putting the various moves together in your head. That's not to say that one or two times I noticed that almost unconsciously I'd had a mental reaction to it. But generally speaking, I wasn't a bundle of nerves. I wasn't shaking. I didn't have people saying to me, "Are you doing the Watutsi, or are you just shaking like crazy?"
I watched a recent documentary about the bomb explosive disposal fellas in the north. One of them said about the suit that in reality it's just kind of for keeping your body together if it explodes, because if it does explode, it's not saving you. Like,
yeah, that's a common expression in the trade. I've heard it many times before, and to some extent he's right, but not always. So if it's a smaller device, yeah, then it will save you. If it's a small shrapnel device, like some sort of nail bomb, the bomb's probably only going to injure you anyway, and this will save you from some injuries. A good friend of mine was caught once clambering in through a window. He had to clamber in through a window to get to the device, and in order to have the agility to do that, he discarded his helmet. The device went off as he was going through the window, and he suffered severe burns. You know, thankfully today he's fit and well. Many years later, he's absolutely fit and well, and you wouldn't know anything had ever happened to him. But had he had the helmet on, then he might not have suffered so badly. The other thing is, largely that's true. If you're leaning over the device and it's a standard sort of device, a couple of pounds of explosive, yeah, awful thing to say, but you might as well think of it as a bit of a body bag that's going to keep you together. But the critical thing is, you're only going to be there for a very short space of time. You're going to spend longer walking towards it, the last 20 yards, the last 10 yards, and longer walking away from it in the same way. And it's that critical point where this could really save you from bits of shrapnel.
So take me back to your training. You said you landed in the north, kind of. Sorry, you spent time there, 83, 84. So I mean, I assume as you were doing your training, there have been a decade of a lot of car bombs. I'm pretty sure the most of the car bombs or the bombs generally in the Troubles were in the 70s. Yeah, what was it like training and going over there?
Yeah, it certainly the atmosphere around Northern Ireland was pretty grim. You would think of it as a threatening place. Certainly in the 1970s, it had been extremely grim for bomb disposal operators. In 1972, we lost 6 operators in that year alone. Now, if you think that, I mean, I don't know how many operators on average we had every year in the province, but it would probably be around 4 or 5 operating simultaneously across Northern Ireland, swapping over about every 4 months. So probably no more than about 15 in the course of a year. So you can see that to lose 6 in 1 year is what? I don't know the maths, but it's probably getting on for about 40%. I know an operator who the guy before him was killed and the guy after him was killed. So you imagine what goes through your mind when you're going into that sort of circumstance. By the time I went there, we'd had a number of innovations that meant that the deaths were less frequent. So we had things, for example, like the wheelbarrow robot. So often you wouldn't actually have to do the walk down yourself, or when it got to the time when you did the walk down, you knew that the robot had already done something for you to make the job a whole lot safer. So there were innovations like that did make it a bit safer, but you still had to be wary all the time. And so in my training, it was a case of learning a constant awareness and constantly running through your head various checklists of what you needed to do. You've already, by the time you get to that stage, you've already done at least a year's training in all sorts of ammunition and explosives, and the very basic level of dealing with improvised explosive devices, IEDs. And then you've gone away to another job somewhere within the United Kingdom or Germany in those days, dealing with ammunition and explosives. You then have to come back. And at that stage, you're facing a longer course, sorry, not a longer course, a longish course of about, in my day, 4 weeks. These days, more like 8 or 9 weeks, because it becomes even more complex. The threats are more complex. But in my day, about 4 weeks. And the culminating week is realistic tasks. You're put in a team with the other operators on the course, and you're tasked from a central position on a training area to go out and deal with mock devices. And each individual is going to get 4 tasks, and you have to pass 3 out of the 4 to prove your worth, to prove that you can go through and do the job for real. And in a way, it's the nervousness of knowing that you may not pass the 3 out of 4. It's more of a concern than what lies at the end of it.
I was going to say, tell us the name of the group that you're actually a part of.
Yeah, as a trade, they're called Ammunition Technical Officers, ATOs. And it's that training in all sorts of explosives, ammunition, explosive chemistry, and ballistics, you name it. It's all those things that stack up your knowledge, so that including things like electronics and metallurgy and stuff, so that when you're dealing with a device, you've got a really wide span of knowledge to draw on. So ammunition technical officers, ATOs, but for most of the time in Northern Ireland, the unit was known as 321 EOD. EOD meaning explosive ordnance disposal. So you'd be detached from your parent unit to 321 EOD for your emergency tour, and the logo for the unit was Felix the cat. Felix the cat, got 9 lives, so maybe we'd be lucky. There is a story that this was by accident. There is a story that the logo was by accident, because somebody phoned up one day and said, right, you can imagine the posh staff officer from the headquarters saying, right, we've got your code name sorted out. It's going to be Phoenix, i.e. the bird rising from the ashes. But you can imagine the chap at the other end going, here, boss, they've just phoned us up and told us we're going to be Felix. Oh, what, like the cat with 9 lives? And suddenly they were.
That's funny. That's funny, that is. I was going to ask you, oh yeah, okay, so you were an army unit, right? And would I be correct in saying you're the only people, if there's a bomb called in or bomb, you're the only crowd that deals with it, yeah?
We'd be the only ones actually dealing with the device, but we had some very close associates who took, I would say, risks as big as ours, and at times greater than ours. And that was the Royal Engineers search teams. And young lads, possibly 18, 19 years old, with effectively something like a metal detector, like almost like you might have seen at the Battle of El Alamein in the Second World War, going along, sweeping it in front of them, trying to find out the things that would catch us out. So pressure pads under the ground, trip wires that you could barely see with fishing line. And these young lads would often clear a way in for us to approach the device. We would do the final clearance, maybe the last 10 yards or so, but they would get us there. And it's a terribly dangerous job, and they had to be extremely brave to be able to do it. So 2 units working alongside each other. I was a Belfast operator, and in our barracks, each of those 2 teams had its separate bungalow, and the bungalows were adjacent to each other. So we had a very close and good relationship.
Can you talk to me a little bit about the like the psychological evaluations that you would have had to go through in order to do this nerve shredding job? Like,
Yeah. Initially, there was no psychometric testing for the first few years. And it was really as a result of what happened from 1972 onwards, when, as I said before, there were 6 deaths in a single year. I can't remember the numbers in 71 and 74, but they're very, very similar. And so we lost a lot of people in a very short space of time. But if you looked back over it, sometimes you might have thought, if someone had thought about this a little bit more carefully, it's easy to say from the comfort of your own home, isn't it? They might not have lost their life. And as a result of which, and they're always, I should explain, there are always pressures on you to do things that you think are wrong, that you shouldn't be doing. And what I mean by that is, this isn't done in isolation. This trying to take a bomb to pieces. It's not done in isolation usually. It's done, for example, on Christmas Eve in the centre of Belfast city centre, with hundreds, if not thousands, of Christmas shoppers all around you, with traffic in a complete logjam, traffic spreading out from the city centre in miles all around, with the fire brigade standing there looking at their watches, saying to themselves, when's this going to be over? The police inspector, who's probably, you're a young man when you're doing this. I was 27, but your police inspector in charge is probably going to be 10 years older or more, looking at his watch and walking up to you every now and again and saying, when's it going to be over? And also an infantry cordon. So infantry soldiers who have to protect you, and they're spread maybe 100 to 200 yards out from where you are, constantly on the watch out for the snipers that may be deliberately trying to target you. So the more time you're taking, the more danger you're exposing these people to. So there's that constant pressure to get things done quickly, but then the rules that you're abiding by don't necessarily allow you to speed things up. So there's that constant mental battle of which side do I fall on? And all of us, myself included, all of us at one stage or another, and sometimes several stages, would have cut corners to get the job done to save other people. And you could look at a lot of those deaths in the early days, and in almost every case, that's what happened. And so psychometric testing was brought in to really say, okay, have you got the robustness of character to evaluate this, do the job properly? Also, of course, be prepared to take a risk, because actually, if you're just going to sit at the back of your vehicle for 4 hours and not actually step outside, you're not going to be able to do the job either. But it's that mix of a sensible evaluation of the risk and being able to take it forward carefully and professionally is what psychometric testing was brought in for. And I remember doing mine. I really wanted to get onto the course, and we were evaluated before the course started. And we were sat in a classroom at the training centre where where the course would take place. Several of us, probably about 10 of us in the room with the exam paper in front of us. And there were questions in there like, do you like thunderstorms? Or if you walk into a room of strangers, do you have the unwarranted feeling that one of them wants to kill you? And obviously, some of these questions, the answer is no. And it always surprised me how people failed the psychometric evaluation, because what? Were they saying yes, they had this feeling about people wanting to kill them? It always surprised me. But yeah, that's what it was all about, and it's continued ever since.
On that note, actually, there's a really good movie. It's set way more recently called The Hurt Locker, and it's about a bomb disposal fella in the Middle East.
I've seen it, of course.
The movie focuses very much on like the PTSD and kind of mental health aspect of it. Did you know fellas over your time who will say like it broke them or cracked them? Not that I'm judging incredibly extraordinary job.
No, I do. And before I tell you a little bit about that, just on the Hurt Locker, that in itself exemplifies exactly what I'm talking about, why the psychometric testing was brought in. So there's a scene where the individual concerned stands in the middle of effectively a spider's web of large munitions that are buried under the ground, and they're all connected at the center by what I would professionally call detonating cord. So, you know, if you set one off, all of them are going to go simultaneously, and he stands there and grabs it and pulls them all up out of the ground. Now, you might do that for real if you were going to risk your life, but you would never just do that. I mean, there are all sorts of ways around doing that, but just standing there and pulling all the stuff up simultaneously. But it's really accurate, I think, in portraying someone who he's got to the point where he's cutting corners. He's already done it before. He thinks he's going to be invincible. He wants to get the job done quickly. There's a little bit of showboating to his new team. I've experienced all that. I've seen all that. I've seen it in others. And to some extent, I've done it myself. Not quite to that extent, but I can see the mentality of why that's happened. In terms of our colleagues, a number have suffered. And sometimes it's hit them quite late. Sometimes it's hit them fairly early on. And I don't really think it would be fair to go into any sorts of detail. Certainly one extremely good soldier I know suffered terribly after having his team virtually destroyed around him on an operation from which he emerged unscathed with a car bomb driving into his command post. I don't really want to go into specific details.
Of course, yeah. God, I can only imagine how tough the kind of survivor's guilt from a thing like that would be.
Yeah, that's the thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so you do your training, you pass your tests, you get over there. Do you remember your first time getting called out to any sort of job?
I remember two or three things. I remember flying in a military aircraft over Belfast and seeing all the twinkling lights below me, never having been there before, and knowing that there were only 3 operators to cover all of that area. I'm thinking, how on earth are we ever going to do this? And just overwhelmed by the prospect of what I was going to face for the next few months. And then, of course, you get there and you've got a couple of days with your predecessor, and you're constantly thinking, look, please let a job come up while I'm here with this guy. So I can see how he does it. I've done all the training, but I want to see this guy do it for real when I don't have to do it myself. But nothing came up and he left. And then the very next day, we always used to listen to downtown radio because they would pick up things like key holders, please report to you. If it was after dark, key holders, please report to your shops because there's a report of a device downtown in the such and such area. We'd pick up things like that, or such and such a street has been blocked off because of a suspected terrorist bomb. We'd hear that sort of thing on the radio, and sometimes it would hit us before our own chain of command were telling us. And on this particular occasion, we started hearing word in the middle of the day about a 200-pound car bomb downtown in Belfast city centre, or suspected. And I remember one of the team coming in to me, rubbing his hands, going, "Wouldn't that be great, sir? Your first job, a 200-pound car bomb." And I was thinking, you may think this, I'm not quite so sure myself. I'd rather start with something a little bit smaller, if you don't mind. Luckily, it turned out to be either not a hoax. If it was a hoax, we'd have gone, but it was a false alarm, I guess, as they often did. I guess the police probably opened the car doors, or perhaps the car owner returned and said, "What are you doing with my car? Why is there a big cordon all around it?" And it was overcome from there. My first job, relatively straightforward. It wasn't actually a ticking bomb; it had already gone off. So, in a way, that was an easy introduction. And you might think, well, if it's already gone off, what are you doing there? Well, what you're doing there is because you don't know it's the only one, and you don't know that it's fully functioned, and you don't know if there's an adjacent booby trap somewhere nearby to catch out somebody who's responding to the first one. And what it was in those days, Belfast city centre used to be segmented off after dark. with what they called the segment gates. So these big metal gates would clang shut at some time every evening and not be opened until, I can't remember precisely, but I think it was about 7 o'clock in the morning. And when they were opened, as they were in those days, the a protective patrol from the Ulster Defence Regiment would go down to those gates, and patrol being about four troops. And they were about 50 yards from the gates when this bomb went off. I'm called out. So here's my dilemma. Why did it go off when they were so close? But they weren't actually on top of it. So is this an ambush device or is it a timer? If it's a timer and they do there at 7 o'clock every morning, you could understand it. But if it's an ambush device, you could understand that as well. Somebody watching from a distance, ready to press the trigger, but perhaps being a bit nervous, perhaps being a bit shaky, perhaps worrying about his escape route, and just going that fraction early where he doesn't actually cause any casualties. The adjacent problem to that is if you've got an ambush device, in those days it would almost certainly be with a command wire, a long electrical cable. And here's the next point. If you find the electrical cable, then somewhere along it, because you have to retrieve it, you have to retrieve the evidence, you have to retrieve the power pack that fired it, somewhere along the wire would often be another booby trap, like a pressure pad on the ground. So whoever follows the cable along steps on the pressure pad and that takes them out. So that's my big concern. It's my first job. I'm a young captain. The Royal Engineers search team from our adjacent bungalow turns up and I say to them, I'd like you to do a 360-degree search, please, to see if you can find this wire. Facing me is a sergeant who's now about 4 months into his tour, who's probably about 4 or 5 years older, who's looking me up and down knowing that I'm the new boy, saying, well, we've never done it like that before, sir. And you're thinking, right, okay, I know what he's thinking. This was just a time bomb and I'm being unnecessarily careful about it. But I thought, well, it's when you're not unnecessarily careful, that's when lives are lost. So we got on with it. He did the search. There was nothing there. Okay, at the end of the day, he was right, but he might not have been. And that was my first job.
What were there's always like when you join any new job, there's like the veterans who've been there years. They always, if they're nice anyway, they'll give you like a few pieces of kind of very distilled advice. Do you remember what they would tell you?
It would be nice to think that, wouldn't it? But the reason I say that is not because they wouldn't. It wasn't some sort of standoffishness. It was because of how you were deployed. So you were deployed. It's easiest if I explain my circumstances. So I was deployed in Belfast, and there were 3 teams in Belfast, and we would take it on a rotation. So you'd spend one day in the most dangerous area on the edge of, for us, it was the most dangerous because, of course, West Belfast in those days was very much the IRA heartland of Belfast. So deployed in a barracks on the edge of West Belfast for 24 hours. Another team in a safer area in East Belfast, simultaneous with that. And a third team largely stood down doing its equipment preparation, cleaning, having showers, because of course you're on 24 hours notice when you were on duty. And you do that rotation. Every 24 hours, the team in the dangerous area would go back to rest. The team in the relatively safe area would go into the dangerous area, and we'd constantly do that rotation. Why am I telling you that? Because you're very rarely seeing the other operators. So what your team consists of is something like 5 drivers, because you've got a lot of specialist vehicles, a couple of infantry escorts to protect you from snipers, a Royal Signals operator, and your number 2, as they call him, who's a corporal in your own trade, but who's not a trained operator, and he's driving your wheelbarrow, he's driving your robot for you and getting your equipment ready for you. So you're not really seeing the other team leaders very much at all because you're constantly rotating. So even if they've done a previous tour, they're not really in a position to give you much advice. Or you could do something over the phone every now and again, but that's kind of it.
Interesting. I guess most explosive generally were in more urban areas as opposed to rural. Did you ever speak to guys who did your job in a rural area? Like, what was it considered easier or more difficult or anything?
The more experienced operators were deployed to the rural areas. So South Armagh in those days, of course, known as Bandit Country. By the time I was there, pretty well all military movement in South Armagh would be by helicopter because it was too dangerous to use vehicles along the roads because of the bomb threat. Um, the the um, the bombs, you're right to a certain extent. The bombs didn't turn up so frequently, but when they did, they were more dangerous. So to compare and contrast, as a Belfast operator, for me, it was the alarm goes off, you're running to your vehicles, the blue lights are flashing, the sirens are going. I've got 7 minutes to get from my operations room on site to Belfast city centre. And I could be trying to deal with blast incendiaries, maybe 2 or 3 down a road. It could be a car bomb that's already ticking, that sort of thing. It's very dynamic, it's very quick response. In the rural areas, it could be something rather more complex, like a member of the Royal Ulster Constabulary has been hijacked from his home. He's been murdered, perhaps after being tortured. His body's been dumped in a field somewhere, and now the body needs to be recovered. But it's not as easy as just sending an ambulance down and picking him up on a stretcher, because the body's likely to be booby-trapped, or the obvious route to the body may have a pressure pad in it or a tripwire, or somewhere where the opposition would be watching us all the time, so they would know where we would put the cordon positions to isolate the body. So they'd also think, well, where should we catch somebody out who's going to be in the cordon surrounding the body while everything else goes on? So the complex planning to initiate an operation just to remove a body like that would perhaps be several days worth. It might even include overflying with a helicopter. It might include all sorts of air photographs being taken. It might consist of having an observation post positioned covertly on the ground to keep the place under observation. So a much slower response, but potentially a much more dangerous situation.
Talk to me a little bit about the robots. Like through the 70s, were they technologically advanced enough to be effective? Like by the time you got to them, I assume they were.
They're really effective. They were really effective quite quickly. You can see photographs of some early ones. I've got one photograph in my records of one that looks like a hospital wheelchair that's been adapted. But those things moved on very quickly over a matter of months. I think the first one was based on a remote controlled, using a wire, not radio controlled, lawnmower. It was picked up at a garden centre by a military officer who was working with a scientific research and development, a Ministry of Defence scientific research and development organisation, and he produced it really, really quickly. And the first one was only intended to tow a car bomb a short distance, because we discovered early on that the car bombs weren't just a ticking device. They might also have something in them that would trigger them if the car was moved. So it only took a little bit of a shake for the whole thing to go up. And so in order to avoid that, the idea was, well, let's attach a hook using this robot and let's just pull it 10 feet or so. And if it's okay, that's fine. Very quickly, though, it was decided that this could be really adapted. And the next things were closed circuit TV camera being added. After that, weapons were being added. So, for example, a shotgun. So you could just go up and shoot into the box, and it might set it off, but on the other hand, it might send the contents all over the place. And so it gradually improved. And certainly by the time I got there, wheelbarrow, if you could get it into position, would always be your first weapon of choice before you did anything else. So we always talk in the trade about when you do those tests prior to being selected for operations, everyone would like to have always the box in the doorway, because the box in the doorway, you stand back at a distance, you send the wheelbarrow in, and the wheelbarrow does everything, because it can get to it, you can see it, you've got the camera on it, you've got the weapons on it. But of course, real life's not always like that.
Okay, there's an image when you think of like bomb disposal of like a bomb being defused, like, okay, so you cut some wire or something and it's done. Roughly, like what percentage of explosives were you able to just stop from exploding, and what percentage like did you have to make explode in order to move on? Like,
Um, I I don't know that I could give you a figure now.
very roughly, really approximately.
Oh, in my case, I never had any big 200-pound car bombs, so I would say a matter of pounds, under 50 pounds spread across the board. But others, of course, would easily exceed that in one job. It was all a matter of chance, really. Um, yeah, and of course the other aspect to this, while I'm thinking about it, of course, it's not just the explosives; it could also be the flame. So uh, I'm happy to tell you about one particular incident where that was the case. We'd gone down to trying to remember the place, but I think it was on the edge of West Belfast. Gone down to a garage, and the story we got on arrival from the witnesses. I was going to say quite a panicky witness, but the witnesses were always quite panicky anyway, understandably, because what they've been through. It told us that he'd been sitting in his office there was a car showroom attached to a petrol garage. And he'd been sitting in his office in the car showroom, and two masked men had burst in, waving pistols around, and they deposited what looked like fuel cans around within the car showroom. He thought there were only two, and he didn't know precisely where they were, but they were in amongst the cars somewhere. So, as always, we thought, okay, the straightforward approach will be to send the robot in to drive up and down the rows of cars until it sees the devices, and then to deal with those devices. It wasn't that simple, because as soon as we got the robot inside, I guess, 1980s technology and everything, there was probably so much metal around in the structure that we lost the camera picture. And at this point, my boss, the colonel, turned up. And always great to see your boss at a moment like this. And he said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, we've just lost the camera picture." Always good to lose the camera picture when your boss turns up. He said, "Well, here's what you need to do." Man of great ideas. What you need to do is jump in one of these armored vehicles, because we had 4 in the team. You need to drive down in front of the car showroom window. And then if you look through the side window of the vehicle, you'll probably see where these devices are. So myself and the driver said, "Okay, so we'll get on with it." And we got into the vehicle, and we drove down. The problem was that there was only just enough room to squeeze the vehicle through between the petrol pumps and the car showroom frontage. So we're now sitting with the petrol pumps on one side of us, the car showroom on the other side, with potentially a couple of blast incendiaries sitting in amongst the cars. But he was right. We could now see the devices, and we could control the robot by simply looking at it. Not as accurately as if we had a camera, but certainly we could try and control it. And as we brought it back towards the window, suddenly the camera flickered into life, and that was good as well. So we hit the first device, and it with a weapon, and it fell to pieces, and that was great. We came back, brought the wheelbarrow back, and hit the second device, and it did fall to pieces, but it also ignited at the same time. So it didn't explode, but the petrol spilt out and started burning. And we brought the wheelbarrow back towards the window, and as we did, we noticed that the wheelbarrow was burning as well. And we thought, okay, we're sitting next to the petrol pumps. The wheelbarrow is burning. Now's perhaps the time to leave. So I said, "Let's go." And the driver, who's a Scotsman, said, "All right, sir." And we did a Grand Prix start away from the petrol pumps and away into safety. Got back to the control point where the colonel was still there. He probably had another great idea by this time. And he said, "Well, how do you know there's only 2 of them? You couldn't see the whole car showroom from where you were sitting." I said, "No, I couldn't." And he said, "Well, the fire brigade need to get in there to put the fire out. So you'd better go and have a look." He said, "I'll come with you." So we both dressed up in the big heavy suits, and for the next 10 minutes or so, on our hands and knees because of the thick black choking smoke that was gathering above our heads. We crawled up and down the rows of new cars to see if there was another blast in Sainsbury. Luckily, there wasn't, and then the fire brigade went in. So
Okay.
it's not always about the size of the bang.
There you go. There you go. Okay, so with that in mind, it's a good place to ask. When you have like a particularly nerve-shredding day like that one, what's it like just going back? You're always on call, I suppose, but what's it like going back and just trying to relax and trying to decompress after such an extraordinary
Yes,
thing?
it's a good question, and I think everyone would deal with it differently. So there was another occasion where something nasty happened to us, and one of our drivers went into total silence really for about the next 24 hours. Because I was the operator and therefore had, in a way triumphed over this device, George and the Dragon type stuff, I'd probably be on a bit of a high. But not everyone would feel like that. And I have to say that on another occasion, well, I should add that when we went back, of course, if you were in the most risky area, doing your 24 hours in the most high threat area, you would still be going back to that same barracks and you'd still be on 24 hours call. So you're still wearing the same clothes that you went to the original incident in. So if you've been crawling around on your hands and knees underneath thick black smoke in a car showroom, or you've just got slightly too late to a car bomb that's just gone off down the street and all the windows have blown out all around you, and you've walked around getting shards of glass stuck into the pleats of your boots, you're still carrying all that with you, and you're still back at base, still wearing smoke-smelling clothes, boots with glass stuck in the soles and things like that, until you've got back to clean up the next day. So it's lingering with you in a physical sense, even if not in a mental sense. And I have to say, on one occasion, which if time permits, we may or may not get to, I woke up in the middle of the night finding that after a really nasty incident, finding that I'd completely shredded the buttons off my shirt in my sleep, obviously prompted by what I'd seen during the day.
Okay, like a lot of, I guess the car bombs, the commercial bombing types, and they were generally called in. I think the standard procedure, they give some kind of code word, and they would give like a time it's going to explode in however amount of time. Would you say, okay, if someone calls up and says it's going to explode in 30 minutes, would you actually take that as being the truth, or would you work around it, or?
You'd have to take it as being the truth, but you might not think it was. So a typical thing would be a day of disruption, where maybe 10 phone calls would come in simultaneously to say that there are car bombs, in my case, around Belfast city centre. You probably knew that 8 out of 10, 9 out of 10 weren't going to be real devices. Maybe none of them were going to be real devices, and maybe this was an opportunity for the IRA to move weapons across another part of Belfast while everyone's distracted somewhere else. Or maybe it was to test our reactions and to see what we did at each one, particularly putting us under pressure, where again, cutting corners might come in. And so the trouble was we'd have to treat every single one as a real device. On my first day of disruption, I was tasked to a beer lorry that was abandoned in the middle of the Albert Bridge, and the Albert Bridge being one of the key arteries coming into Belfast city centre. In those days, it's all been redeveloped now. I've been across there many times since, and it's all brand spanking new houses in certain places. In those days, you'd look across the river from the city centre, and it would be rows of derelict houses on the opposite bank. The panicky witness, always a panicky witness, had been in the pub having his lunchtime drink before moving on with his beer deliveries that afternoon, a whole stack of beer kegs on the back of the truck. And he'd been approached again by armed men in the pub and told to open up the lorry. They'd put ostensibly a device in the footwell on the passenger side, and he'd been told to drive the lorry now to the middle of Albert Bridge and abandon it. and that they'd be following him down. If he got out, they'd shoot him. So he'd better do it quickly because it was already ticking. And this was what I turned up to. The difficulty for me initially was this is a beer keg lorry, and beer kegs were often used to house explosives. So I'm thinking, oh no, there's like 20 beer kegs on the back of this lorry. Do I have to deal with each and every one? But luckily, the evidence suggested that they hadn't had time to tamper with the beer kegs. That would have been a nightmare. We, of course, drove the wheelbarrow down as the first method of operation to try and hit the device in the passenger compartment. So, as always, we'd shoot the window in to get the arm of the wheelbarrow robot through the window and into the vehicle. But because of the angle, we couldn't angle our weapon down to shoot at the device. So there's only one option at this stage. Somebody has to walk down to it. So this is the point where the big heavy suit comes on, and the colonel turns up. And he says, well, what are you going to do? I said, well, it looks like I'm going to have to walk down there. We would have something called a soak time, which was a mandatory waiting period before you walked down to a device like this. And that soak time would be based on the known sort of timers that the opposition used, because even if the device went off, if the area had been cleared, it was a case of saving life first before property. And that life included your own, that of the operator. So we hadn't even started the soak time really. And the colonel says, we've got a day of disruption. We've got devices all over the city. You better just get down there and get on with it. So being young and foolish and generally carefree, I said, yes, sir, and got the suit on. Just before I was about to set off, a fella in a tweed jacket wearing a flat cap sidled up to me and said, can I just talk to you for a minute? And he, of course, he had a Belfast accent. And I said, yes, of course. And said, I'm the intelligence officer from 10th Battalion of the Ulster Defence Regiment. And I just wanted to let you know that we think you're being set up for a sniper shoot from the derelict buildings on the opposite side of the river. So I said, thank you very much for that information. But by now I've got nothing I can do with that information. I'm all suited up, I'm ready to go. So off I go. I tootle on down, I deal with the device, I come back. And someone in the police walked up to me and said, I don't know how you've got the nerve to do that. And I'm thinking to myself, yeah, neither do I. And then we moved on to our next device.
Actually, on that note, and we talked a bit about the psych evaluations. I don't mean this like in a bad way, but I think in order to be able to put that aside and just say, look, I'm going to go do this, there's multiple ways for me to die in the next couple of minutes. Does that take someone who's I don't want to say have a few screws loose, but like that it's such an extraordinary thing to be able to put your emotions and stuff to decide and deal with that, you know?
Yeah, look, I come back to the training being extremely good, but I also come back to the cutting corners being the most often cause for people having a fatal or a serious accident. The training should have allowed me to do everything appropriately and stand a very good chance of survival. The thing that was cutting into the training, as I may have mentioned before, always that pressure to get things done, was the colonel saying, we haven't got time for that, just get on with it. And saying, yes, sir, and getting on with it. And at that stage, I guess you're thinking, well, let's just hope I'm lucky. But that's how accidents happen, basically. But I have to say, I tried to put the sniper out of my head. I tried to put out of my head the fact that the timer may still be ticking down, and just got on with it.
I didn't put out the episode yet, but I interviewed an ex-para and SAS man. And he wasn't involved in bomb disposal, but he told me that the bomb disposal people, they much preferred to be going to an IRA bomb as opposed to a UVF or UDA. Given they said like the quality of the bomb makers was better in the IRA and less unpredictable. Was that the case with G? Did it make a difference who made the call for the bomb?
Yeah, I think it's a fair assumption to some extent. I'd probably quantify it. I think you could probably tell who'd made it. I mean, circumstances alone would dictate it. You know, if it's a bomb in West Belfast, it's probably been delivered by UDA. If it's a bomb in the city centre or East Belfast, it's come from the IRA. But yeah, you could tell the sort of lack of professionalism, the clumsiness, the lack of inherent safety features, because the IRA learned very quickly in the early 70s. They kept blowing themselves up, and so they started putting in further safety elements to protect their bombers on the way to the location. UDA were less good about that, and so you could probably tell. However, what that assessment doesn't take into account is the level of cunning and expertise. And so, you know, as I came across, mentioned before, it's not necessarily the device that you're thinking about that's going to get you. It's something else. It's the pressure pad in front of the cardboard box that you think is the device, or it's the fishing line attached to the trigger guard of the pistol that you think is the target, and you're just picking up the pistol, but then you're pulling the fishing line and setting off the booby trap. It's the cunning and deviousness of the bomb maker that the IRA would be so much better at.
Okay, can you talk to me a little about the types of bombs that were used as the decades went along? Was there a time when like TikTok timers were more the thing as opposed to remote, as opposed to light, pressure, so on?
Yeah, I don't know that there's necessarily a very distinct chronology, and there will be overlaps, and old technology would still be used later in the day. But along general lines, you could say initially you were talking about very simple devices with a burning fuse, nails perhaps inside a glass jar with some form of explosive inside, and a detonator. You know, advanced, you know, nail bombs, things like nail bombs used to put inside a post box as a, you know, just a demonstration of threat in a way. But gradually transitioning into, so what's the next stage? You can't just constantly throw these devices because you become a target. So you want to be absent when the device is going off, or at least concealed. So you then get into timers. A lot of timers in the early 70s, and you know, Bloody Friday in Belfast, shops being blown up, pubs being blown up, you know, really nasty stuff with no real care for the civilian casualties. And so lots of those, probably around 1971, 72, lots of ticking time bombs. But also, as I mentioned earlier, the IRA learnt about the safety processes. And so there was an explosion in, no, I was going to say something else, but I'll change that, because I've just realized that what I was going to say wasn't quite accurate. But putting in a further timer as a safety mechanism, so that it wasn't just the ticking timer for the device itself, but one that's going to give you time to get the device into position. Particularly important when you start coming on to booby trap devices. And so the difficulty with a booby trap device is the slightest movement's going to set it off. And that's obviously key for the victim, but the bomber doesn't want to be setting it off himself. And so again, putting a timer in place to ensure that whatever he does with it, it's not going to go off until that time has ticked round, but by that time he's hoping that it's going to be in position. The last incident I went to in Belfast, we believe it was a Protestant bomber, and it was quite curious. It was in I think University Street, and the situation was a family that was under intimidation. It was a Catholic family, and the only reason I remember that is because when I went into the house during the clearance, it was a typical Catholic home with religious pictures and religious statuettes around. And I can't remember whether it was son or daughter or son, but one was going out with somebody from the opposite faith. And as a result of which, the family had come under intimidation. And we arrived too late, because what had happened was the householder had opened her front door and noticed that there was a holdall, a sports holdall, in the front garden. And they'd been under threat before, and I'll explain that threat in a moment. As a result of which, they called the police, and the police turned up, and a fella walked up to the householder and said, "Well, what is it?" She pointed out the holdall, and again, there's this. I keep coming back to fatalities from cutting corners. At that stage, they should have evacuated the area, called us. We could have dealt with it, but no. Instead, they opened the holdall to see what was inside. The device exploded, and both of them were killed on the spot. I was then tasked for the usual reasons. Has it all gone? Is there another device there, etc.? When I arrived, I got the intelligence brief that was, shockingly, this was the second device at their house, and the other one had been exactly a year before to the day, and had been set up. And this is why we assumed it was a Protestant bomber, because it had been set up at the back door as a booby trap, and it had exploded while he was setting it up, and he'd lost a limb. I can't remember whether it was an arm or a leg. I think it was an arm. He'd lost a limb as a result. So now, spookily, exactly a year later, and this has gone off in the front garden, the front door has been blown in, half of the front wall has been blown out, and I'm now there on my own, smelling the acrid smoke. I don't want to go into too much detail about the scene, but obviously a really quite disturbing scene. And going into the house and thinking, this peace-loving family with all of these religious icons around the place, why would it happen to them? Probably just sitting at home having their tea when they heard a noise outside or something like that. And now the policeman's gone, the woman of the house has gone. But of course, my big concern now is the back door, because a year ago it was the back door that had been attacked with a booby trap, and so that had to be tackled really, really carefully. That was the incident where, when I went back to the barracks afterwards, completely smelling of all the smoke, with my boots, unfortunately, with blood from the scene on them, with, as always, the gritted glass that had been blown out in the boots, and then going to bed that night in a sleeping bag, as we always did, on an iron bed frame. And it was that night at about 3 a.m. I remember waking up thinking, what's happened? And I just clawed my shirt open, and all buttons had popped off. And I don't think I was mentally affected very often, but obviously that one had left a real big impression that day.
I was going to say some of just the sensory things that you would experience, that there'd be type of things that a human never really should. Like, I can only imagine what the smell would be like, or like the smell of maybe like human flesh that had been burned, and to see that, would it, if you don't mind me asking, would it like come back to you years later? Would you have like little flashbacks and stuff?
I haven't really experienced that, so I've been lucky. I know several of my colleagues, I wouldn't say a lot, but several of my colleagues have, including a couple who were medically discharged from the military because they were no longer able to function. So it can have catastrophic effects on some people. However, I went from that Belfast tour to being an instructor with something that was called the Northern Ireland Training Team, which was training infantry soldiers to go and do their tours in Northern Ireland. And of course, I'd gone there as the expert in terrorist devices and weapons and all that sort of stuff. And we had a small team, and we used to operate out of a hut in the middle of a training village. The training village was set up to look exactly like an urban area in Northern Ireland, with its own security force base, and the troops would go into the security force base and stay there a week and go out on patrols 24 hours around the clock. We would film everything, and then we would debrief them, and we would throw incidents against them constantly, and we'd debrief them using the films of the incidents. And when it's all changed, so I can tell you this, but when they used to task a bomb disposal unit, it would come over the radio, Felix request over. And that's when the prickles would go up on the back of your neck, because you were Felix, you were the cat with 9 lives, and you knew that any minute someone's going to be saying, right, it's a suspected car bomb, Belfast city centre at such and such a street. This is the safe route to approach, blah, blah, blah. And we used to carry radios all the time, so we could, in the training teams that we always knew what was happening on the ground. And I remember sitting in that hut one day, and the loudspeaker in our operations room went off. Felix request over, and the hairs stood up on the back of my neck. So I didn't think there were any long-term effects. I don't think there were any long-term effects, but clearly there was a knee-jerk reaction to that sort of thing. So obviously it, you know, ticked away somewhere.
I can't remember where I read it or saw it, but at some stage remote bombs were popular enough, but then I heard that the British, the Army or security forces were able to use some kind of blocking, some signal blocking thing, and then they weren't so common. When did that take place? Would you know?
The first ones would probably come in probably towards the late 70s. Prior to that, they would have used a reel out a command wire, a twin flex command wire, so that there was a direct physical link between the trigger point and the device itself. Yeah, probably towards the late 70s, and you know, initially using very simple radio controlled means. So the sort of thing that you might use to fly a model aeroplane, of course, and therefore all being based on very simple range of megahertz of like hobbyists would use, and therefore quite simple to block, I would say. You know, I'm not a scientist, but you know, electronic scientists would be able to deal with that. Of course, the battle then became how to avoid the blockers and how to get something that was like frequency hopping, and how do you block that? And so there's a constant game of having to block the things. Yeah, you're right, and lots of measures were put in place to ensure that that couldn't happen.
I've heard as well about a Mercury tilt bombs. Can you tell us a bit about them?
Well, a Mercury tilt switch. If you get a glass file, small, and you have a drop of mercury in the bottom, and then you have two little pins maybe going through the top, and then those pins are attached into an electrical circuit. The only thing that's stopping the connection between the two pins is that drop of mercury. So it's in a very, very small bottle. I was looking around to see if there's something I might be able to show you, but probably no more than an inch long, and probably about, I don't know, under half an inch across.
Would it be kind of like a spirit level?
Yeah, exactly like a spirit level, exactly like a spirit level. And so as soon as that little thing tilts, mercury drop slides along it in an instant, creates the connection between the two prongs, and bang, off it goes. And so, yeah, really, really dangerous. And that's why, of course, when making those sorts of things, the opposition had to fit in a timer to ensure that if that accidentally happened for them, at least the timer would still be breaking the circuit.
Did they get used all through these 3 decades of conflict, or was it did it come along later?
Mercury tilt switch is a pretty common sort of you might still expect to find that now. I mean, it's as long as you put the safety thing in place so that you're clear while it's all been after it's all been set up and put in place, it's perfectly effective. I mean, people would often say to me, "Oh, I imagine it's got far more complex now, and you know, bombs are terribly detailed." You know, the more complex the device, the greater the threat to the perpetrator, but also there's more chance of things going wrong. So, you know, simple and basic will often work, and it's more the tactics, the tactical thinking behind how you lay it, how you catch somebody out, is probably far more effective than a really complex device. I mean, if you look at Afghanistan and the devices that were used in the war there, endless pressure pad devices buried under the ground so that an infantry patrol would step on it. And therefore, you know, the difficulty comes of what routes can you use? What routes have you used before? Where are the likely places where you're going to go firm? You know, avoid the crossroads, avoid the road junctions, avoid something that looks like a rubbish pile, maybe, avoid the derelict houses. You know, all those sorts of things will constantly be going through your mind.
I've heard as well, maybe not so common, but I've heard of like light activated bombs where in the darkness it's fine, but as soon as a torch gets gets put in that'll set it off. Did you deal with many of them?
I never encountered any of those. As you say, they're not so common. And again, for obvious reasons of complexity and trying to set it up, and what's the light level going to be, and when's it going to be activated, and so on. But yeah, they have existed in the past, and even to the point where in my day we would have a remote controlled illumination device that could be put in place, and if you suspected that a light activated device was there, you would set this up and from a distance illuminate, and then if it was there, you're going to set it off, but at least you were safe. But they become complex, and as soon as you get into complexity, again, you come into risk and potential failure.
What's the closest you've ever been to a bomb or an explosive device exploding?
Probably about 20 yards by a complete accident, really.
How big and stuff?
We responded to a car bomb in Belfast city centre, and when we arrived there, it was really in the centre with on a crossroads. The police had set up on the crossroads. Our team vehicles went slamming into the crossroads. I jumped out and did my usual thing. What is it? Where is it? How long has it been there? Has anybody been up to it? Has anyone seen it? Etc. Etc. All the usual questions I'd come out with. And the policeman said, "It's that one over there." And I looked down and I said, "What, that car, like about what I was expecting, about 100 yards away, maybe more?" He said, "No, this one here." And it's now about 20, it's a different car, and it's about 20 yards away. And I'm thinking, we're virtually on top of this car. So I suddenly turned around, because we were on the crossroads. I said to the team, "Get on vehicles around here quick." And they swung round into the side road. And as they did, as the last vehicle came in, this thing went off. And I still remember the engine block flying down the road. There was petrol in it as well, seeing a sort of flaming engine block flying down the road. And in my head, this is how it feels in my head. It was like almost a nanosecond later when all the windows around us, going up sort of 3-4 stories high, just went. And I think that was probably my first experience of getting lots of glass in the cleats of my boots. Yeah, so about 20 yards, I would say. We were lucky, no casualties. Big solid buildings, and the blast went straight down the road. Really, really lucky.
Did you feel? I've heard there's like a kind of a like a shock wave, like a physical kind of wave. Did you feel that too?
Do you know what? You're absolutely right, and I've often felt it in other circumstances, but I don't remember it on that occasion. I just remember thinking, "Oh God, we've missed it," because I really wanted to get the car bomb. I really wanted it not to go off, and so my overwhelming thought was, we got here like a minute too late, and it's gone.
Did you? I'll let you go there very soon. Did you ever deal with these like up and unders, they would call? Like you put put one under someone's car and they start the car and explodes?
On the car booby trap, not personally. I have a very good friend who did, and lost a hand as a result. And they're really, really dangerous things. But no, I was lucky. They can be a bit tricky to deal with. Getting access to them, for example, is a bit of a problem. But no, I was lucky. Sadly, I did go to a couple of instances where they had been in place but had already gone off, and then you're dealing with the after effects of that, which is, as you can imagine, quite unpleasant. But yeah, I was lucky. I didn't actually have to deal with a live one.
Let's say you do get a call. There's a bomb somewhere. If there's a couple of seconds between that and being told what sort of explosive device is in your head, is there like, God, I really hope it's not this, and I'd much rather it's that? Is there like a list of preferences, if you will?
That's a very interesting question, and the fact that I'm laughing about it and thinking, having to think about it, I don't know that there is necessarily.
Is there like a worst one? Like, God, I hope it's not.
So you're in your ops room, you're listening to downtown radio. You can hear that there's something starting to build up on the streets. you can hear other units starting to chatter on the radio net. You know that any minute now the tasking is going to come through. Perhaps the telephone's going to ring through from the headquarters in Lisbon or the brigade headquarters, and there's going to be a staff officer saying, "Oh, we've got a nice little job for you. We'll be tasking you in about 5 or 10 minutes, so please be ready," just to give you the heads up. And then you're waiting for that crackle over the intercom, Felix request over, and then you're bundling out. By this time, you've got all your kit together, you're bundling out of the hut and into the vehicles. But I suppose what you don't want is something that's really difficult to access. Anything else, I guess, is probably fair game. So it could be anything. It could be a find of a weapon. It could be a blast incendiary in a car showroom. It could be a suspected ticking car bomb in Belfast city centre. It could be a beer keg lorry blocking Albert Bridge. You really don't know. And what you do know is that in advance, they will have given you as much information as possible, either over the phone or over the radio before you start heading out. And then you're already starting to work out your plan.
Would you work like very well and succinctly with I don't know, let's say RUC or different security force units? Would you kind of get in each other's way or clash or have different ideas about how to go about it sometimes?
Well, no, not really. I mean, the RUC would generally be on the ground first, because somebody's probably walked up to them and said, that car's been parked in that restricted zone, as they were in those days, for the last 2 hours and nobody's come near it. And actually, I've noticed that the passenger door is slightly ajar or something along those, something that would make it suspicious. And so the police have started to evacuate the area. It's taken them time to do that. They've probably liaised with the local infantry battalion. The infantry have sent patrols down to reinforce the cordon and continue the evacuation and protect from snipers or any other form of attack. And so by the time you're arriving there, the situation is sort of under control. I say sort of, it might have got there very, very early on in the process. And probably one of the first people you'll speak to is the RUC guy. He's probably an inspector. Alternatively, he's going to be the infantry company major, or both of them. And also, of course, you'll have the fire brigade there quite often, and they'll be saying, "When do you think you're going to finish?" And you'll be saying, "I don't really know." But we were very supportive of each other. There wasn't a clash.
One final thing, when everyone thinks of bomb disposals, like, your mind goes to like movies and stuff, and it's very often this thing about like, oh, do I cut the red wire or the black wire or that kind of thing. Was that ever the case, that there was like fiddling about with cutting wires and stuff?
Do you know what? I don't think I can tell you. It is a skill. It's a very high level skill within the trade, and generally speaking, you wouldn't need that on a day-to-day basis.
Fair enough.
But I mean, what we do see is things like, I don't know if you watch the TV show Trigger Point. We do see things like that, and that's a series about bomb disposal on the UK mainland. And looking at that, you do every now and again go, no, why did they do that?
Very good. We've come to the end. Thank you so much now for everything you've shared, all the insight. Great stuff. I've been meaning to speak to someone who dealt with bombs for quite some time. Is there anything just before we go, anything you wanted to mention we didn't get to, or anything like that?
No, actually, I had a few things that I thought you might want to talk about, and you've hit all of them with one exception. So yeah, I'm perfectly happy with that.
Thank you so much again. Now everything you shared, really appreciate it.
Okay, absolutely no worries at all. If the price of, I'm just looking at the bookshelf, if the price of 321 Bomb Gone drops a little bit,
right,
you'll get all that history in it.
Oh yeah, I wish Guy, I really wish I could have read it, but yeah, it was going for like silly money online and stuff.
Yeah, I know. If I see it drop, I tell you what, if it drops down to a sensible price, I'll buy it for you and send it.
Oh, you're very good. Appreciate it. I'm looking forward to reading it. So good man.
Okay, cheers.